Welcome guys. This is going to be a summary video for Unit 1, Area Study 1. So the very first topic we look at in Year 11 Legal Studies is what's known as legal foundations. So in this particular video, this is going to be a three-part series. We're going to be looking at the following key areas. So we're going to be looking at KK1, KK2, and KK3. So in terms of what we need to look at for preparing for this very first SAC is we need to make sure we're very comfortable with the following 8 key knowledge areas. So in a SAC, you can be assessed on any of these 8 areas. So it's really important you know them in quite a little bit of detail to make sure you can answer every question. So starting off, what I really want to stress in legal studies and what's really important is that you need to have a really good understanding of what's known as task words. So in your assessment task, you're going to be given questions, and at the start of each question is going to have a task word. In terms of the content in legal studies, it's very straightforward most of the time, but where people tend to struggle and lose a lot of the free marks is where they don't actually do what the question is asking them to do. So a common one that I always see is in terms of the word distinguish. So if you see the word distinguish on a SAC, it's really important you're stating a clear difference. So an example might be, it might say distinguish between an apple and an orange. You'd want to sort of start your answer by saying the main difference is something like the taste or the color or etc. Versus another one I really commonly see is you might see something like a discuss question on a SAC. And if you see a discuss question, you really need to make sure you're talking about both sides. So if you think about the argument, there might be either strengths and weaknesses, what something does or doesn't do, but we need to sort of consider both sides. So this would be a really good slide to pause on and make sure that when you see each of these task word examples potentially on a SAC, you know what each of them are asking from you. So starting off with our very first key knowledge area, what it is about the role of individuals, laws, and the legal system. So what we need to first make sure we really know is this term known as social cohesion. So it's the very first key knowledge area. And we need to know how social cohesion helps basically protect our rights as members of a community. So when we move on to what the definition is, and what I highly recommend as you're watching the video, I recommend taking some notes, pausing to make sure you just take in the content that we're going through today. So very first one is social cohesion is a term used to describe the willingness of members of society to cooperate with each other to ensure that individual rights are protected. So what that means in simple terms is a socially cohesive society is one that works together and they're underpinned by really strong laws to make sure everyone lives in a safe and comfortable society. So a few examples to help you understand what that might mean is something like the Surrender a Knife, Save a Life campaign. So ensuring we have a socially cohesive community, we offer this initiative such as you can hand in your illegal weapons such as a knife. There's no punishment or consequence associated, but the whole aim of the program is to take knives away from our street. Another example is something like Neighborhood Watch, where members of the community all volunteer to look out for certain areas of wrongdoing in the community and point it out and report it as required to help keep everyone protected. That's the key term we're looking at here. We want to make sure everyone in a socially cohesive society is protected. So how does it actually achieve that? So the first one is our laws. Our laws really importantly provide us guidelines. So what that means is laws tell us what is right and wrong, it tells us what's acceptable, and it gives us sort of a foundation of how to behave. So an example, really simple to understand, is something like murder. We know murder is against the law and there's obviously very severe punishments for committing that offense. So generally speaking, most people are aware of that law and choose not to break it due to the harsh consequences. Secondly, the role of individuals. So that's you guys and everybody else. It's your responsibility to know about the laws and how to follow them. So that'll sort of tie into some of our later topics we look at here. But laws are there to make sure that everybody knows about them and we are aware of what that involves and how to abide by them. Next one and last one we have is the actual legal system itself. So if we don't have a legal system, we can't actually ensure this socially cohesive society. So what that means is we have a set of methods that makes our laws. So that'll be Parliament and courts. We have a set of principles that implements our laws, and then we make sure we have someone to enforce the law, because there's no point having a law if no one's going to follow up on the consequences. It's just like having all sorts of rules in a school and then no one's actually there to enforce the rules. No one's going to follow those rules overall. So that's our very, very first key knowledge area. Pretty straightforward. Okay. Moving on to what's known as our principles of justice. So in terms of the principles of justice, if there's a key knowledge point I can stress, it would be this one here. If you're planning to do year 12 legal studies, this is a key knowledge area you're going to see all throughout year 11 and 12. So if you get your understanding of the principles of justice down pat early, it will make your life really, really easy in later settings, because these sort of principles of justice questions are often thrown at 6 mark plus questions. So it's really important that you understand them. So my advice for you guys is that we have 3 principles of justice. I always recommend just remembering fairness and access. I'll go through all 3, but I would say fairness and access are the most applicable, and there's a lot of confusion between fairness and access at the same time. So I recommend using these 2. So the first one, fairness, is all about processes, procedures, and principles that ensure everyone is treated fairly. And what we don't want is having fear or favor. So we don't want one party treated differently to another. We want to make sure everyone has the exact same processes. So an example of how that might work is what's known as the doctrine of precedent. So that means that we can predict all outcomes of future cases based on what's happened in the past. So if there's been a list of 100 murder cases, they might have similar outcomes in terms of sentences. We can use that information to predict a fair and reasonable outcome for a future murder case. Or another way we have fairness in terms of your legal rights is that you only need to give your name and address if you're asked. So that protects your right to incriminate yourself. So what I recommend remembering for this SAC is remembering this definition here. And then what you might be asked to do is you might be given a case study or a news article, and you might have to say, how does this particular case study or news article achieve fairness? And then you're sort of talking about some of these examples here. Okay, so that's fairness. Moving on to equality. I won't spend too much time on this because, like I said, I recommend doing fairness and access, but basically pretty straightforward in terms of the name. Everyone's treated equally before the law, and everyone has an equal opportunity to present a case. So regardless of whatever background, whatever language you speak, any sort of impairments that may be involved, you all have the exact same status and rights. An example we've got in Australia is the Koori Court, which is available for Indigenous people to access. So that's an example we use to promote equality. And last one, which is my favorite one of the 3, is access. So access is all about you understanding your legal rights and how you can pursue your case. So what barriers can we break down for you to allow you to understand your rights and make sure that if you need to access or pursue a case, you have the means and you know how to actually access the system to ensure you can have your dispute resolved or essentially even readdress disputes. So an example might be if you are unable to afford a lawyer, you might have someone like Victoria Legal Aid provide you a lawyer at no extra cost. Or another example might be, rather than you going to court straight away, you can use things like complaint bodies or tribunals, which are often cheaper or low cost and allows you to get your case pursued and resolve your dispute without having to go to court altogether. Okay, and the very, very last one we're going to look at today is these 5 characteristics of an effective law. So generally in a SAC, you won't have to know all 5. Generally speaking, not always. I kind of recommend remembering 3 or 4, but they're pretty straightforward and quite easy to explain. So I'll go through all 5 and give you an example of how to talk about each one. So first one is all about it being clear and understood. So what I want you to think about when you think about clear and understood is that the average person needs to understand what the law is and how it impacts them. If the average person cannot understand what that law involves, how are they supposed to follow it? So one example I always use is if you've been to the CBD or the city before, things like these parking signs here are super confusing and really, really difficult to follow. And for the average person, sometimes it can be very difficult to understand what this sign is actually asking you. So obviously it's very difficult to follow, and we want to make sure they're really, really clear for it to be effective. And I've got an example here you can pause and read as well. Second one here is a really easy one to use. For a law to be effective, it needs to represent all of the majority of the community's beliefs. So if the majority of Australia agrees with that law, it's going to be really easy for people to follow. If 90% of the people don't agree with a law, then chances are you're going to have a lot of difficulty enforcing that law and making sure people follow it. And how we make sure we reflect society's values is basically everybody over the age of 18 has to vote, and they vote for who wants to represent their views and values. So we have what's known as a representative government with regular elections. So an example might be something like littering. Most people would agree that littering has quite a harsh environmental impact. So obviously we have laws against littering to help promote and save our environment. Okay. Thirdly, we have known. So if you want to introduce a law or you want to have an existing law, we want to make sure that it's communicated effectively. If you make a new law and you don't tell anyone about it, it's going to be really, really hard for people to follow. So we want to make sure that laws are distributed through media. So things like TikTok, Instagram, newspaper, perhaps for an older generation. That's going to make sure it's really, really consistent and easy to follow and keep up to date with what the laws are. A law we had introduced a little while ago now, but in 2017, is that motorists have to go 40 kilometers an hour when passing a stationary police vehicle. So that law was introduced to keep our emergency workers safe. And what they did is they published this on the Vic Roads website, they made campaigns about it, and they made it very clear so people knew about that particular law change. All right, the second last one is enforceable. Like I spoke about with school rules just before, if we want to introduce a rule, we want to make sure that we have an appropriate consequence for it and we actually follow through. If we only give half the people that break a law a consequence, it's not very enforceable, it's not really doing an effective job. So we want to make sure that people know if they can't get away with it, they're less likely to break that law. So we want to make sure people are well aware of that law and understand the consequences associated. So what we might have as a really easy example is you might have heard of a random breath test or things like blood and alcohol, drug testing. So what happens if you drink drive is that you face large fines and you also have a cancellation of your driver's license. So this law is very enforceable, and most people tend not to drink and drive because they understand the severe consequences associated. And for a lot of people use their car to get to friends' house, family, work events, even work itself. So people generally don't want to lose their license, so they're scared to break that particular law. Our very, very last characteristic of an effective law is that it needs to be stable. So the easiest way I think about this is murder. Murder has been in the Crimes Act since it was passed in the 20th century. So it's been around for a long, long time. People are well aware of what murder is and what it involves. So we want them to be able to adapt as required, but we don't want them to change really, really frequently so confusion occurs. So what we might mean by a law adapting is if you think of bullying 100 years ago, you could only really bully someone face to face. But now if you think about in our current day, you can bully people online. So they've had to introduce things like cyberbullying laws to keep up to date with the laws. So hopefully that sort of makes sense. So here's a point where in the video, I know it's been going for about 14 minutes now, but you might want to pause. So an example of a practice question for you to have a go at applying these characteristics is if you think about introducing a one-punch law or a ban on the Nazi symbol. I know both of these are existing laws now, but a question you could have a go at is to what extent do you think the new law needs to be introduced in Victoria? And in your answer, link to 2 characteristics of an effective law. So if you choose to go with banning the Nazi symbol, for example, you might like to see that you might like to say that I agree this new law needs to be introduced to a great extent. So starting off with the extent to which you agree. And then you would maybe want to start if it addresses the characteristic of reflects society's values, because the majority of people agree that it's a symbol of hatred and it should be banned type thing. So you sort of go along that argument there. That's a really good practice question. Or any new law you can find online, you can have a go at applying the characteristics to that particular concept. But this is just an example. So just to wrap up on this video, a couple concluding points is, like I said at the start of the video, go back to those task words at the very start. Make sure you understand what each of the task words are asking you. Because like I said, the content is generally never too hard. Most people lose all those free marks from not addressing those task words correctly. So if you really get in the habit, particularly during reading time, of saying, yep, explain needs me to do this, this, this. Compare means I need to do this and this. You'll really make sure you get some high quality answers and be getting those full marks. Secondly, just remember your principles of justice you have are fairness, equality, and access. Start to get very familiar with them if you're planning to do Year 12 legal studies, because you'll see them a lot. And like I said, I recommend sticking to fairness and access as your two to talk about. And lastly, with those 5 characteristics, just aim to remember 3 to 4. And it's always good to have an example up your sleeve to help you explain whatever it is the concept you're talking about. So hopefully guys, that makes sense, and I'll see you guys in part 2.